Hi, everybody. Welcome to our symposium. It's great to see you and great to have people online. I'd like to welcome you to our symposium today, something I'm really looking forward to hearing from my colleagues. We've been working on this for a while, and it's the symposium, the Roche Symposium on Community Matters, Developing Alzheimer's Clinical Trials Together. So I've been thinking a lot. The whole conference, it's been so interesting, the themes that have been going through the conference about inclusivity and diversity, meaningful engagement, those kind of things. And it really has, one of the things that meant a lot to me was the plenary session yesterday when Bernd Heis said, I change and I will stay me. And it's had me thinking about personhood and how important personhood is for all of us, for each one of us in the room, really. But also, equally, it connects us to who we are as people, but it also is important for us to be connected to each other. And the theme of this year's conference about building bridges is so important. It's about how we, as people who work in AD and dementia and supporting people living with dementia and their families, their care partners, how we can intentionally build those bridges and make sure that we have those connections and that we bring that meaningful inclusiveness into all that we do, in whether it's care or whether it's clinical trials. It's so important to have that connectivity. So these are our disclaimers. This is indeed a Roche Symposium, and it's meant for people outside of the US, sorry. So I've already introduced myself. No, I haven't. I'm Wendy Weidner. I'm the head of research, and I've got my boss sitting back there, and he's going to say, wait a minute. I'm the head of research and publications at Alzheimer's Disease International. So that's me. But I also want to introduce my esteemed colleagues here. We have Ramin Nilforooshan. He's a professor in psychiatry and consultant psychiatrist for older adults specializing in dementia. We have Carmel Geoghegan, who is sitting in for Helen Rushford-Brennan, who was unable to join us, so very kindly has joined us today. And she's an advocate for the voice of the person living with a diagnosis and their care and support team, working on keeping a spotlight on dementia and taking the mystery out of diagnosis. And last, we'll have Karan Jutlla. Dr. Karan Jutlla is the dementia lead for the Institute of Health at the University of Wolverhampton. She is a passionate researcher and educator dedicated to promoting cultural inclusivity in health and social care with a particular focus on dementia. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion today. Here are our disclosures. So today we really want to hear from you. So this is a very brief introduction, but we're going to be doing some polls. Then we're going to hear from our colleagues, and we want to leave plenty of time at the end for questions and interactive. We're going to have an app that I'm going to show you that you can actually upload questions. You can upvote questions as well if you like specific ones, and people who are watching online can equally vote and take the polls as well. So we're going to leave plenty of time at the end for that. So this is just some housekeeping. Please make sure your phones are on silent. Again, I said we'll be doing the questions on the app, but equally we will take questions from the room as well if you will have a roaming mic. And at the end, we're going to have an evaluation form that will have another QR code. If you would fill that out, it'd be really helpful because we really believe that it's an iterative process. We want to make sure that we're doing better each time. So we'd love to hear how you think about the symposium. So here's the important app. Oh, sorry about that. So if you could scan that code with your phone, it's going to be so easy, even I could use it. It enables you to answer the poll questions that are going to be coming up, and also to vote on certain things and ask questions. So it should be really easy. It should magically appear for you. I'm going to leave it there for a second until I see people starting to put their phones down. Everybody get it? Good. Okay, so now we're starting. We want to know who you are. We want to know a little bit about who's in the room with us. So please, could you answer this poll that's going to come up on your app? Can you tell us which statement describes you best? And like magic, it's going to appear for me. It's all starting. Oh, it's exciting. I get to see. Okay, so we've got about 15% of 18% of the people are specialists in Alzheimer's disease. We've got about 5% of people who are general neurologists. About 30% are patient organization representatives. Some carers in the room, which is really important to us. And we also have about half of you are none of the above. So it's very interesting. I would like to find out about you afterwards. All right. Let's see. We've got another poll for you. This is an important one, actually. Do you feel that clinical trials for Alzheimer's disease are currently designed with every participant and their care partners in mind? What do you think? Okay, overwhelmingly no. This is very interesting and really important to know this. Really important to know this. Okay? And next, how important do you consider co-creation of clinical trial designs in Alzheimer's disease? Okay, not surprisingly, you feel it's very important, and I'm glad. And slightly fewer of you think it's somewhat important. So now I'm going to turn it over to Ramin first to start talking about why we think it's important. Okay, thanks, guys.
The first talk after lunch is always difficult. When I was in training and was a junior doctor, one of the jobs of junior doctors is always about reading the latest article and criticizing it in any way that you could. Oh, this trial is not right, they've done it in this way, that way. It took me a few years until I started becoming PI and doing the clinical trials and drug trial to realize that how tough is running a clinical trial and how difficult it is to run the clinical trial, because it's different from day-to-day clinical work that you do. And as you know, it takes 10 to 20 years for a drug that comes from the idea to the market. And therefore, you want to make sure that when you get to the phase 3A or 3B, everything is done perfect, because you want to get the best result. You want to make sure you present it well. And therefore, all those things are really important. And I think for that reason, we've got today's meeting to talk about that, how to design the study with people with Alzheimer's disease and how we take it forward. So if we could look at the map from there, you could see that from the idea that it comes to the point that the trial begins, it's a lot of point there, and every point is a lot of effort to pass it. I don't know how many of you have done a clinical trial and drug trials, but it's not just like, here you are, recruit patient, take this drug, all done. It isn't. It's a really tough things to do. And therefore, you have to make sure that when you write the protocol, you know your population. You can't just say, I want to do this trial. You need to know you have the right population, how to talk to them, how to bring them forward. They become like a family with you, because I have patient trial for the last 3 years, and it's different from a patient that I've seen clinical setting. So it's very important that every aspect is done very accurate. Also the material. I don't know how many of you seen the protocols for a clinical trial. It's like a massive book, and they expect you to read this and know everything. It's like 100 pages. And then some of the other things is massive. So we want to get things straight for clinician, also for people with dementia, because they are that making the trial easy. This is just one example of one of the clinical trials. So it's people who come and participate in clinical trials. it's a lot of commitment from them, because it's not just, here you are, 6 months appointment, come over there. No, it's lot of new commitment, and they have their own life, and we think that here you are, or you're in a study, can you come next Wednesday and Thursday? Oh, no, don't come Thursday because I'm busy, so come Saturday morning because I want to take Thursday. They've got their own life, and it's important that we realize that they're doing us a favor by coming to a trial, and it's not just they're free and why they're not coming and participate, because some principal investigators, they think, oh, I've got 100 people with Alzheimer's, only 2 of them came forward. Because look at this, you ask them every 4 weeks to come for physical examination, blood test, MRI, organizing things, many phone calls, because if MRI is cancelled, then someone needs to call them, bring them forward, lots of new things that they need to do. So when we talk about Alzheimer's trial, it's tough, but it's tougher because we're talking about the person that their cognition is changing. So it's different from a cancer trial, different from other trials. You're talking about a carer and a patient both together. You need to explain it twice. So it's much tougher. So when you approach people, please approach them in a very nice way, because they're doing us a huge favor of participating in clinical. And we know that we need those clinical trials. I know I'm not allowed to talk about drugs, but this year is a very important year, and hopefully would be many more in future. So I think we need to consider that. So what we want to do, we want to move from the idea that a scientist in a company decide that this is a good trial and I want to run it this way, to a point that a person with dementia and their loved one or carer come and say, yes, it's a good idea, but it won't work because you asked me to come and sleep in a sleep center 3 days. How am I going to do that? I've seen studies that they said a person with dementia needs to stay in the sleep center for 3 nights. I said, but do you understand how much you're asking? And it's not easy. But no, because they wanted data, and they said 3 nights data is important. So we need to combine both together and make sure that it's there. Also, we want to know that it's from a person to people, that they come at every aspect of it. And this shows that we all talk about cognition as very important. Yes, it is very important, and all the drugs need to work on how they work on cognition and slow down the cognition. But there are lots of other things that people with dementia and their carers are involved with. Sleep disturbance, the psychological and neurological behavior of dementia is very important. So maybe we need to ask people, which one is more important for you? So the idea maybe needs to come from them, and that's important. And then we move forward. Have you looked at the information sheet? It's like 5 pages of information sheet, and you expect the person to read it and then sign a consent and remember everything there. Sometimes it needs to be concise, maybe some pictures. I know ethics committee, they are guilty as well, because they want everything in that leaflet without considering that things are not easy. So that's very important. And then we want to know how to communicate with them. Do they want email? Do they want telephone contact? Do they want us, one person, to contact them? So all those things are very important if you want to run a clinical trial. So in one of the studies I was doing, the people had home nursing. And then I received some feedback from people that, can we make sure that one nurse come for injection or for other things? Because we know this person, we already explained how we want it to happen. When you send the new people, every time it takes double the time. You can't expect them to stay at home for a whole day. If the nurse said, I'm going to come at 10 o'clock, it means 10 o'clock, because they've got their own life. So, and people, they don't realize that this is important to pick up. The other thing is about, if you changing things, if you want an emergency MRI because of some side effects or anything else, how to communicate with them, how to tell them over the phone. All those language needs to be prepared, and talk to them, to the person, say, how would you like us to tell you if something else is happening? So those information are very important. The adverse event and everything else, it may be normal for a doctor or a researcher to talk about adverse event, but to the person, talk to them before this study starts. How would you like us to tell you that your blood result is out of normal? So, the reason we want people, because we want to run this study smoothly. We want to make sure that this study works really well. We don't want the attrition rate, because those data are very important. We know how expensive it is to run this study, and therefore it's important that they stay from beginning to the end. We want to make sure that we have fewer side effects. We want to make sure that everything works with them, and they tell us how they want to run it. It's not about the scientific question, it's about how to run the trial with them. And then we want to recruit quicker, because this quicker we recruit, the easier would be for the center, and also they are the one that will be champion for us. So if they're involved, they will be champion. What I'll do now, I'm going to hand it over to Carmel that talk from the different angle. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramin. We'd love you in every clinical trial lead. First of all, I just want to say again that Helen, I'm taking her, well, no, I'm not. You can never take Helen's place. No, they're not the words. Unfortunately, she can't be here because of her illness. It's just nothing to do with Alzheimer's. And so I am delighted to have been invited by Roche to give the carer supporter perspective. And I'll just give you a little bit of my background. I was born and raised in the west of Ireland, and I came back there in the 90s thinking I had this romantic idea of moving back home. Anyway, in 2010, my dad died, and my mom came to live with me. And in 2011, we knew there was something wrong. We got a really late diagnosis for mixed dementia, vascular and frontotemporal. And we left the neurologist's office with these two phrases that I had never heard of. I had heard of Alzheimer's, never heard of dementia. And we went home. Now, I have to admit, I was quite delighted with myself. We had a label, but that was it. There was no signposting to supports, nothing. So, and that continued for 3 years. Until Mum passed away, everything was a fight. It was constant. And then I started I suppose it was my way of grieving, to start to speak out. And I wanted Mum's last 3 years not to be wasted. I said, I want to change other lives. It would have been as simple as giving me a picture of the brain and what effects each dementia had. That's all I needed. If I understood that, it would have made such a difference. Anyway, moving forward, before Mom died, I had started a diploma course in social gerontology in NUIG, because a neighbour told me to go back to education, because education is power and you won't lose an argument. I thought, I want that. So I got involved in the Voice for Care, which was probably one of the first PPI in Ireland. It was a cross-border. So moving on, then I got involved with the Alzheimer's Society of Ireland and I'm now on the HSE research, which is huge in Ireland, to get them like examples of when we went to join some of these. Don't have anything too technical, because the carer wouldn't understand that, or nothing too complicated. Now, luckily, some of these were on Zoom, these meetings during COVID, because it was probably just as well for some of the other participants. So, of course, global brain health. And then in 2017, Helen invited me to support her travelling. And that just took it to a whole new level. I came to Alzheimer Europe. And as I said this morning, and Helen will keep saying to thank them, it's just been the most amazing experience being here since 2017. It's just working on a different level, getting to know ADI, Chris down there, and then all the other countries in between. And it's just the knowledge transfer it's empowering. So Collaboration, and I've learned, I'm involved in so much now and promoting PPI, public-patient involvement, and I believe engagement is coming along at the end now, plus global brain health. It can be confusing, is the voice, public-patient, and apparently in Australia it's consumer involvement, even with medical, so I think that's a bit odd. But why do we need to collaborate? Well, the research needs the lived experience. It has to be valued. The individual and collective voice must be the centre of all research. And if you haven't realised that, obviously the most powerful voice is that of the person who's living with the symptoms, taking the drugs, and the person who's witnessing the side effects and sees the huge discrimination and bias of our own attitudes out there. I'll move on to, these are the elements, I suppose, that are constantly brought up when we're doing a terms of reference now for PPI. And we're not looking for an awful lot. We're looking for respect. We want to be involved from the start. We do not want to be a tick box exercise and a token at the table. Our knowledge and experience is vital. We want to be there when you're at the very beginning, when the idea for the research is being developed. And it's quite amazing if we are there at the table, how that idea can change. And it can completely change from what you went in with originally to what's the finished and what we're going forward with. So we want to be there to develop it. We want to be a partner. Co-creation. We want to be then remuneration is a big thing at the moment. It's not always monetary. We can be co-researchers, co-authors. We can carry out focus groups. We can do interviews. We're quite bright. We can co-present at conferences. We can speak to students and what you need, and young researchers in particular. And most importantly, it's essential, we are that essential link to the community that you need. Because there has to be trust between all the sectors, and we're able to build that bridge between the researchers and the potential participants, which is the most important thing. So communication is key, and that's always the first thing we talk about, the jargon. That has to go, we want plain English. And it's not difficult, because sometimes researchers think, how am I going to put this into plain English that they'll understand? But it's actually not that difficult. So, and all of us have different learning methods. And so I would be a visual person. I don't like a lot of script in front of me. It just doesn't register, whereas a picture will go for 1,000 words. So we want to be at the table as well to set the agenda. And we need, really important, adequate notice of meetings, not the day before. And especially if you have a cognitive impairment, how is someone going to process the evening before papers that need to be assessed and reevaluated for the next day? And anyway, we should be there at the table when we are setting the agenda weeks in advance. We can chair, we can co-chair. And we need to set our expectations, they need to be set out at the very start. So we all know what we're getting and what we're expecting. So communication, I think, is an effective use of language. And especially working with the marginalised, which is what we're trying to do at home now. The ethnic minorities, we have a lot of new Irish communities. And of course, English isn't their first language, and even we have a lot of Irish-speaking, our own native people. So language is so important, and that's why I think virtual is, the imagery is so important. And I'll just give you a few examples of my experience so far in, research. I've had mixed positive and most actually are positive. But there were a few negatives, and I just want you to know that, like I've told you, don't put anything complicated. But I was accepted for one clinical trial, and I live in the west of Ireland, and that's why I'm always talking about rural inclusion. and the trial was in Dublin, which is the East Coast, right across, so it's 4 hours. And because I asked for an overnight, because I couldn't drive at 4 o'clock in the morning to Dublin, I was dropped from the study. Now, I was told why, because they weren't paying for it, and they were only using the cohort around Dublin that could use public transport. Well, that wasn't a true study, so it was very limited. Oh, is that on? Okay. So partnership. We want to be there, as I said. We want the research to be successful. That's the most important thing, because we're the ones that want the outcomes. We just feel too much research is wasted. So we'd love to see less duplicating, and maybe that you'd pool your funding and do a better research, more wider. And most important, keep us informed. Don't forget us. We can help with dissemination. And if the study is shelved, would you please tell us? Don't leave us waiting what's happening. And if we weren't accepted for a clinical trial, tell us, and tell us why. And don't leave that bad taste in our mouth that we are never going to go back to anything to do with research. And I'm just going to finish, on my little quote. I found, I'm always Googling, when I found this, I think this is just quite amazing. In 1927, American physician Francis Weld Peabody, he wrote, we won't decide why we're laughing, no. Disease in man is never exactly the same as disease in an experimental animal. So, we need to combine scientific information with a dedication to understanding the patient experience. And that was cited in 1927, and I'm just saying, 100 years later, we're finally here. So thank you, and I'm going to pass you over now to Karen. And that's Helen.
Thank you, Carmel. Can everyone hear me? It sounds very quiet from over here. Good. Get closer to the mic. I'll speak a bit louder. I'm very quietly spoken, so just wave at me if you can't hear me. Firstly, thank you, Roche, for inviting me to speak about this really important topic. I've been doing sort of research and education in equality, diversity and inclusion in dementia care for, believe it or not, 10 years now. So it's really nice that you've invited me to talk about the importance of this in clinical trials. So what do we mean when we talk about equality, diversity and inclusion? And I've put this slide up because, believe it or not, when I have delivered training sessions with health and social care organisations, managers and leaders, and I say, can you tell me how you know that you're achieving EDI in your services? They quite often say, because we treat everybody the same. And it's not the right answer. And that's what this slide really shows here from your image on the left-hand side, your left. If you treat everybody the same, then you stand risk of putting people with certain characteristics at an unfair disadvantage. So equality, diversity and inclusion is about achieving equity. So it's about making the necessary adjustments and adaptations that need to be made so that everybody has fair access and equal access to whatever the set or activity or goal is. So just being clear about what we mean by equality, diversity and inclusion. Let me skip. Okay, so we know that certain groups from certain backgrounds with certain characteristics can experience discrimination and disadvantage based on a number of different reasons. So we know that people experience disadvantage based on their age, their gender, if they've got a disability, if you're from a particular ethnic group, gender reassignment, because of a religion or a belief, or a lack of religion and belief sometimes, because of someone's sexual orientation, being in a marriage, civil partnership, or even being pregnant or having a baby. And in Britain, it's against the law under the Equality Act to discriminate against anybody based on these what we call protected characteristics. Now, if you're diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease or any type of dementia for that matter,
because of the cognitive disabilities and sometimes physical disabilities, then people with dementia too fall under the Equality Act. But it's not as simple as we've heard in some of the presentations as just having one issue. We have the complexity of intersectionality here. So we've got what people experience, or what we call in academic literature as double or triple jeopardy. So you could be someone diagnosed with dementia of a particular ethnicity, and also, for example, from lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual group. So people experience lots of different complexities around their identity. And I also feel that to some extent we are all covered in the Equality Act, because we all have an age or something that puts us in the actual Equality Act. So because I've only got 10 minutes or so, I couldn't possibly talk through all of these and the importance of them in clinical trials. So what I'm going to do is focus on ethnic minority groups, so ethnicity, by way of illustration about how we can achieve inclusion in research and in particular clinical trials. So what do we know from the evidence base when we think about dementia in ethnic minorities? And this evidence base is in relation to research and literature in the UK. So we know that some people from certain ethnic minority groups are actually at greater risk of developing dementia. So we know that vascular dementias are quite common in South Asian communities, for example, and Black Caribbean communities, due to higher risk factors like hypertension, diabetes, stroke. We know that some people from ethnic minority communities are less likely to access all points of the care pathway and are most likely to present in a crisis situation or when they're at a later stage of the illness. We know that quite often diagnosis is missed or it's late, and we currently still need to develop culturally appropriate assessment tools in dementia care. So we have some issues around those, particularly for migrants who may not know who the president was in the UK in a particular year, and those sorts of things. So we have some work going on around there. We know that they have reduced access to treatments and inappropriate or inadequate support, coupled with problems caused by language barriers, with most things being available in English first. Because a lot of ethnic minority communities in the UK tend to have socio-economic disadvantages, they generally have poorer health outcomes than the rest of the population as well, and they are much less likely to be represented in health and social care research, including clinical trials. So we know that there is a real lack of representation of people from diverse communities. And furthermore, according to the Runnymede Trust and estimations that were made in the UK, by 2051 we're expecting a 7-fold increase in the numbers of people living with dementia from ethnic minority communities. And that's important because it compares to a 2-fold increase in the white British population in the same time period. So a real need to, an urgency, if you like, to start looking at this now. So in 2016, we received funding from the East Midlands Academic Health Sciences Network and the East Midlands Clinical Research Network of the National Institute for Health and Care Research to develop a toolkit for increasing participation of people from Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities in the UK in health and social care research. And what we did to develop the toolkit was we invited members of the community from an ethnic minority background, so these are just public members of the community, and also researchers who had experience of conducting research with members of ethnic minority communities to come and partake in a number of workshops. And what we wanted to know was what enables people to take part in research and what acts as a barrier. So we really wanted to find out from people, why don't you take part in research? Why aren't you represented in all that clinical research that we have? And the key themes that came from our workshops, similar to the literature base, where people were saying, well, we're over-researched and under-serviced. So people continuously being asked to take part in research, but don't see any reflection of that in practice in any way. So that causes obviously a lack of trust, and this lack of trust was really interesting because a lot of people, particularly migrants who came to the UK in the 1950s and 60s, experienced some form of racial discrimination within services, which caused a lack of trust and got reflected in research studies as well. There were communication barriers surrounding research, so Carmel's talked about this as well. So, you know, we use a lot of jargon in research terminology and just expect people to know what we mean by it, and they don't. So people really not understanding. And also when we think about language and literacy skills, so Carmel prefers visual, big Ramin talked about, you know, booklets and information sheets being 5 pages long. Imagine if you can't read English. Or even imagine if you can't read or write your own home language as well, your mother tongue. So my grandparents migrated to the UK from rural Punjab when they were very young. They didn't go through schooling, and they can't read or write any language, including the one that they speak. So they're very visual and audio in how they get about. And also a lack of awareness about certain diseases and conditions can also limit people's participation to get by. So I'm going to give you a whistle-stop tour of sections of the toolkit very, very quickly. And how we developed these was we brought together an expert advisory group and the project steering group to develop it. We then went back to the community and said, you know, is this important? Is this relevant? Sorry, I know people were taking pictures there. Quick whistle stop tour, I've only got 2 minutes left. So the first thing to say when you're looking at doing research with people from ethnic minority communities is you must consider the communities that are taking part in the actual research. And I know that sounds very, very obvious, but the amount of times we see a research study in a particular area, and you can see from the sampling method that it's not representative of the communities living within that particular area. Secondly, oh, I'm stuck. There we go. So just elaborate what Carmel was talking about, effective PPIE. We need to give meaningful time around this so that we can build trust with community members and people who may be taking part in research. We need to think about effective recruitment strategies. I've got a question mark next to community leaders because one of the things our participants told us was actually people go to faith leaders and community leaders as the gatekeepers, and what happens is you indirectly exclude a really big community of people who aren't engaging with faith leaders and community leaders, and quite often they can be the people that close the door instead of opening it. So think about unconventional methods. We must think about cultural competence in research studies and how we work with the team to unpick unconscious bias and stereotypes that we might have towards other communities subconsciously and how these play out in the research. Effective feedback, really important. So as picking up on Carmel's point, people saying, well, we take part in research, but then we don't know what's happened with it and we don't know about the findings. So now when I put in for a research project, I never do so without costing in a video, smiling at Ellie, without costing in a video or something audio to feed back to people in a language that they'll understand. And then the final recommendation, of course, is to do everything at the beginning of your grant application so that you can effectively resource and cost in all of the additional support that will be needed around language, interpretation and resources. And I think I completely went over. Just to say, if people do want access to the toolkit, it's currently being developed as an e-learning package for NIHR, but there is a hard copy available. I didn't put the link in, but if you just Google my name, you'll be able to go on my website for more information on the toolkit and how to access it. And on that note, I just want to close very, very quickly by saying that a lot of the information that I've said is very similar to the things that Ramin was saying and very similar to the things that Carmel was saying, which just tells us and shows us that if we get equality, diversity and inclusion correct in clinical trials, we get it right for everybody. So it should be everybody's business. So on that note, thank you.
Thank you so much. Now, listen, it's amazing themes going through that about being listened to, being meaningfully engaged, and that actually if we get it right, we get it right for everybody. That's a perfect way to finish it off. I just wanted to kick off our discussion with another poll, because we really want to hear from you, but we want to kick this off briefly, please choose a topic that you'd like the panel to discuss further. And then I'm going to stop standing up here and I'm going to sit down with everybody and we'll just have a conversation. So please go ahead and vote. Is this working? Hello? Thank you. Okay. Okay. So we've had our votes come in, and it's really not surprising. It's the last one, the communication to build patient and public relationships. How perfect when we're talking about bridging that gap. And so I'm just going to put it to my colleagues here, and they're going to give a brief answer each. How would you do this? How would you communicate to build PPIE relationships? I'm going to hand it over to you. Oh, okay.
I think we need to have. I think we need to have a new way with clinical trials, and many clinicians, they use the style that they use in clinics when it comes to clinical trials, and I think it's completely different, and therefore the whole communication is different from just sending a letter, say, come for outpatient appointment. So I think everything requires good training, and these training to become an investigator or working as a researcher currently is not available as part of a curriculum for many clinicians. So those things are very important to be part of that training.
Yeah, Ramin is correct. I suppose training is so important, and it's probably something that researchers and clinicians aren't used to, hearing the voice of the person. We're usually being talked at and talked to rather than with the person and the inclusion. So, and I think it's definitely, I've seen huge changes in the last number of years. And I think it's going to happen rapidly because of days like today, and we're a respected voice now. And it's when it's highlighted at big events like this, I think that really brings it to the fore, and it's on a because of virtual now, it goes on a global scale. So I am really positive about the future and our part in it.
Yeah, no, thank you, Carmel. I think for me, when I think about communication to build patient and public relations, I'm automatically thinking about those different diverse communities and how different communication has to be with them. And for me, it's really about the use of language and how we engage with people and the terminology we use. And I would just ask people to think about translation and interpretation and working with people to get that right. So I've been in lots of situations where people just do a direct translation of their information to the language that they need it, but actually when you say it back, it doesn't make much sense at all. So really, really working with people to make sure that communication is clear and in a language that they can understand. And I think people really appreciate that, and that's what I've found. So, yeah.
I've got a comment, question from a colleague here.
A question or a comment, I don't know. First of all, I think it's important here to understand that all these notions of involving people with dementia and relatives in trials is not only important in regard to dementia or Alzheimer's or any other disease, but in all other diseases. People with dementia also have cancer, also have diabetes, and it's very important to see whether this medicine works in real life, that you have that kind of experience, as it is important to have ethnic minorities or others. And so this is not only for trials regarding dementia. The second part is you as a pharmaceutical company also have responsibility towards those who are excluded from the trials. Very often we hear of persons Going into it, you're looking for persons with MCI or maybe symptoms, and somehow, in the process, they are excluded, but they still have the same symptoms, they still have the problems, and they are not only referred to GPs or others. You need also to take care of the persons who are not involved in the trials. That's important, especially if you have a beginning disease of dementia. And thirdly, it is when you also have to see the gap between the setup of the clinical trial, the culture, and reality in wards, in care homes, and in homes where people actually live, because you follow the persons in the trial with nurses, well-qualified staff, and so on, and that's not the case always if you go to care homes, or if you go to wards, or if you go to the person's homes. So you have to have these three elements in mind also. Thank you.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think the environment of a clinical trial is never the same as real clinic. But we try to make it as real as possible. But we know that people come to clinical trial, they get lots of attention because of its clinical trial, and it's different from people in care home or people in their home. I agree that it's about every aspect of clinical trial, but today we only talk about the dementia aspect of. But yes, people they should be involved in any part of designing a clinical trial.
We have another question in the audience, and I'm going to take some again from the app, because these might be people who are joining us online. Thank you.
Thank you. I have two comments and also an opportunity for further discussion, if we have time. The first is that there are people who are completely excluded from clinical trials, at least to my knowledge. For example, those with sensory deficits, specifically deaf people. We ran a project about having the ability to adapt a cognitive screening test in these people. And we see that there is lack of literature, lack of training materials, lack of information, awareness campaigns in these people. So it's also the same for their participation in clinical trials. So there is a lot to think, or I don't know if there is a specific policy. And the second is that, to my knowledge, the main complaint of people participating in clinical trials is that they don't get feedback of their data. This is the first, and I think most, to my experience, thing to listen from them.
Very good points. I don't know whether Karen, you want to speak to the first point about the inclusion, people being excluded, and maybe Carmel, the second point about.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. And I know that there's so much work to do generally for people who have sensory impairment. So, you know, how we, again, think about making things visual with basic sign language and skills that can communicate with people so that they're able to understand and participate. And certainly when we're developing training materials, we have to think about all those different sensory impairments and how they're included. So I do hope that we now start to move that way of how we can be more inclusive for people, particularly with sensory impairments. But I think, thank you, because it is big and we do need to start developing those resources as well.
I would probably say why I got involved in raising awareness was because of the rural-urban divide, and I would imagine it's probably the same in most countries, but if you're in a rural area, there is nothing, there's no supports, and most in smaller, like in Ireland, everything was happening in Dublin, all the research. Now that's changed and there is more, but the majority of the projects would be, so that's like totally inaccessible for people. It's just not going to happen. And the feedback, it's non-existent. So, and actually, sometimes you're told you're never going to get it, which isn't, that's not acceptable. That's why we're going forward. And the reason we get involved in research is, and that was the one thing Helen taught me, she said it wasn't for her lifetime. And until you get something affects your life and your family, you don't think about these things. You don't think about research, or you think you're never going to die and you're never going to get sick. It just doesn't happen. So I realized from her that, you know, we have to put ourselves forward for research. That's how things are going to change, and maybe not for us. And I had that experience in 2019 when I got breast cancer. And I realized, my goodness, if research hadn't happened and the cure for the type I had only came about 15 years ago, I wouldn't be here today. So research, and now I can go out and say, research is so important. You can't dismiss it, and we want to be part of it.
Okay, I've got a question that's come in online or through the app, and it's an interesting one regarding how demanding it can be to participate in research. Do you think they need to be compensated or keep it voluntary? I'll let you start, Ramin.
I agree that we should compensate them, but the problem is about all the rules and regulations attached to that, and I think the companies, the drug company, the pharmas, they have to follow the exact rules and regulations. If you pay people, then you're introducing a bias that some people come in. But I agree, sometimes people come in for a whole day. And yes, we offer them breakfast, lunch, but it's a whole day of their life. So maybe it's a new negotiation that we can't expect people to just spend all those days for nothing.
It's really interesting because when we did the workshops, when we were developing the toolkit, one of the things that people said was that incentives should be, given to people for taking part, because people feel that they want to sort of feel valued. And then when you think about paying people to take part, you end up with all this contract issues of setting people up as potential employees on your project because you need to pay them, and it gets incredibly complicated. And I think because of some of those barriers, it's easier for researchers to not go down that road, to make it a bit more user-friendly and to stop that bureaucracy that happens. So how we approach that now in research is just, through vouchers and a pot to reimburse people, one, for anything that it's costed them to come, but to also give some sort of incentive. But I think it's difficult, Ramin, like you said, because of the bureaucracy around paperwork and setting up payments. So I think we have barriers there to that need to be addressed.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. We have to have out-of-pocket expenses. And it's not always about, and especially for some people, it affects their social welfare payment or their pensions. So a voucher is really good, and their mileage or whatever. But we had a PPI festival in Ireland last week, and Saturday was in Galway, and it was interesting. They were from all different walks and different backgrounds and diseases and that. So, I always look for training. I'm happy to be upskilled. I want to know how to do an abstract, read research properly. I just want more and more information. So the training, the vouchers. But some of them said on Saturday, which was really interesting, gym membership, pool for swimming, in their location, which was fantastic because, and there was other various ones, maybe even, not everybody there's digital poverty in Ireland. I'm sure it's in most countries. They don't have broadband, they don't have an iPad, some people don't have a phone. And nowadays we take this as given. So you can provide people with an iPad, and they can get a brain memory games. So there are various things, and you have to show appreciation like that.
Okay, some excellent questions, and there are more here, and I wish we could stay here, honestly, for another half an hour, because I think there's some really burning questions. So I'm going to ask you a question now, 2 questions, and then I'm going to ask you to fill out the evaluation form to tell us more about what you think and what we can do next time, okay? help. Oops, I'm pushing the wrong button. There we go. So please, can you use the QR code again and tell us, following this meeting, how important do you consider co-creation of clinical trial designs in Alzheimer's disease? Overwhelmingly, even more convinced than before, because you thought it was important before, which is amazing. Yeah. And nobody doesn't think it's important, which is fantastic. Great. 90%. And finally, following this meeting, do you feel more excited about the future of clinical trial design? Well, that's good. Over 91% of you say that, yeah, you are. Thank goodness for that.
It's like in Russia when
It's like... There's always one in the audience. Okay, fantastic. Thank you. And finally, if we could just ask you to this is a new QR code, if you would scan that and give us an evaluation. Thank you for participating today. Thank you, Roche, for this symposium. Thank you to Alzheimer Europe for giving us this platform.